Hello and welcome to Perspectives. This is episode number 2. I'm Leonard Zane and I'm joined here today by Don Kramer. And Don is a business executive and also an actor who was in one of my audio theater productions, a science fiction piece called Introverse, where Don did a sterling performance. But here we're going to tap more of his left brain, I think, today than his right brain. So Don, good to have you here.
Thank you, Zane. Nice to see you again.
So here we are with Perspectives, and the name of this program today is Strides for Maximizing National Happiness. And we've got some slides to show. And Don's going to summarize a little bit of this first slide, the points we want to make. I'm just going to give a little introduction first, that the 21st century is an amazing time. That we suddenly have access to escalating data that's growing exponentially. The internet searches, these kinds of things. We're getting information, we're getting in-depth information, and it's leading to some surprising revelations and discoveries that we didn't know going into the 21st century that we know now. And myself, having straddled both centuries, have seen this development, which is very exciting to me, to see how much we're learning, and it's surprising us, and we hope we have some surprises for everybody today. So Don, you might mention these points we're going to cover in Strides for Maximizing National Happiness.
Most certainly. You know, it was just a few years ago, in 2006, there was the first global happiness study conducted by the University of Leicester. Now, this involved 178 countries, and they were investigated to find out what the most important reasons were for the concept of national happiness. Surprisingly, 2/3 of those reasons were explained by just three variables, quite simple variables that we've all talked about and are probably, as a society here in the U.S., quite familiar with. That would be universal health care. Second would be low poverty. And the third would be universal access to higher education.
So those three things are going to explain 2/3 of the reasons of why I'm a happy country, if I'm a happy country.
That's according to the study. So this study was quite extensive, and with the university, this was quite a significant piece of work that resulted in identifying the 8 happiest countries here on our planet. And they are, in their order, as you see on the screen there: Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Iceland, the Bahamas, Finland, Sweden, and Bhutan, in that order. That's an amazing discovery, that much of these countries are actually clustered in that.
In Scandinavia.
Yeah.
Now, Bhutan, and this list is pretty much the same nowadays as it was before. Bhutan is an interesting country. It's up in the Himalayas, very small country, and it's a monarchy. But they took this study by the University of Leicester, headed by Adrian White, and they applied those criteria. They started interviewing all their citizens, and they have an index called the Index of National Happiness. They measure national happiness every year, like we would GDP. And so Bhutan, just by the fact that the country and the leadership of the country has been so interested in the happiness of the population, this thing really works. I mean, they proceeded with these 3 criteria you're mentioning, plus others. And so here's this little tiny country you would think would be really poor. I mean, near Tibet, near India, you would think they'd be quite poor and backward, but by golly, they're on the track. And here they are, one of the happiest countries. Okay, now let's look at healthcare here a little bit. You mentioned universal health care as the number 1 criterion for national happiness. Mm-hmm. Well, here's an embarrassing thing economically for the good old USA. And by the way, the USA, I think when that University of Leicester study was done in 2006, I think we were like number 23, which isn't terrible, but we weren't one of the top. So one of the reasons that we don't have as high happiness as we could is the United States is one of the few countries, in fact, maybe the only advanced country in the West that doesn't have universal health care. And so here's a chart that was compiled by a political scientist at UCLA, an expert in healthcare. And this one shows that, guess what? The cost of healthcare in the United States, when it's both government and private costs, compared to other countries, many of whom are in that top list, our cost is double the cost per person of healthcare of other advanced nations. So here we are, a very rich country. We don't have universal healthcare. Ours costs twice as much as theirs. And guess what? They live longer than we do. Here's a chart of longevity. The United States is this gray one over here.
Right down here. Yeah.
And Don, you might be able to point out some of the countries are some of those that are the happiest.
Well, the ones that are at the top of this list for the folks looking on the TV would be Japan. Again, Switzerland shows up there, number 2, and Australia at number 3. I did a little study on my own to see what did I pay out of my own paycheck year to year. Surprisingly, 18.3%, almost 20% of my private costs, my costs and my employer's costs, went to just medical care. 20% out of my salary. So when you add up all the other things that are taken out, Social Security, federal, state taxes, the number blew me away. 57% of my paycheck, of anyone's paycheck, goes to taxes, health care, Social Security, workers' comp, disability, and it's an amazing figure that just blew me away. In other words, if we called universal health care a tax, it's another 18% of tax that I'm paying.
Well, that's huge, and that's compared to other countries that have government-administered health care. I mean, it's not owned by the government.
Exactly.
But they administer it, and the private sector performs the health services, but they're doing this for half our cost, and they're living longer than we are.
And they're happier. They don't have necessarily the expense of doing administrative paperwork, co-payments, deductibles, all these other administrative things that really, frankly, I think if you talk to the average person working, they're burdened by the complexity of a healthcare problem. We're not talking about a doctor visit. Yeah, you may pay a $20 co-payment, or if you go to an HMO, you may pay very little, if anything. We're talking about something that gets very complex when you get very ill. You don't know what to do. You don't know where to turn. You're kind of confused, and really, at that point, you're really unhappy about your situation.
Okay. Now, I saw a figure, and it was from a trusted source, an institutional source, as I recall, and it was that our overhead costs for processing normal private health insurance claims without government involvement is like, it was 23% just for overhead for them to do. Government processing of even our Affordable Care Act is 1% administrative cost. So a lot of it is in overhead. This is counterintuitive from everything we like to know in America. You know, we're big on private sector. I come from the private sector. I was a business executive there, and yet this is staring us in the face. And this is the number one reason for national happiness, universal health care, and we don't have that. The next one you were talking about.
Yes, low poverty was the second observation as far as the study at the University of Leicester. And it said that low poverty and living wages, the happiest nations, were taxed the wealthiest of their citizens and the companies, which results in minimizing the poverty in that country. Now, this is an important factor because this policy that these countries have chosen to do serves to even out and serve the self-interest of even the wealthiest people, because it creates more societal safety, a lower crime rate, and a greater overall social harmony and the progress for all citizens as a community.
So therefore, if I'm a multimillionaire, and I believe this, I've had clients in this category, if I'm a multimillionaire, it's at least rationally selfish for me to pay some taxes or to lower poverty, because I'm going to have a better life. I'm not going to have to surround my home with 10-foot tall, iron fencing and all this kind of stuff. My kids are going to be able to go to whatever school. People are going to be able to walk the streets at midnight and not be afraid. This is a big factor that it's actually, guess what, selfish for even rich people to want to do this if we look long run instead of just in front of our noses. We have a lot of perspectives that I want to get it right now. I don't want other people to be as well off as I am. I don't trust them anyway. And however, low poverty, these other countries consciously wanted to do that. And what do you know? They're happier. Denmark?
Denmark, yes. They've described their participation in this as an investment in society. They're purchasing a quality of life in aspect to what they're doing. It's not just, a category for everybody to fit into. It is a conscious, long-term commitment for a quality improvement of their life.
So Don, if that's true, am I going to lose my individuality?
Well, absolutely not, because you're free to be happy because you don't have the anxiety and the concern about if you lose your job, if you lose your health insurance because you lost your job, and a sort of domino effect of one loss here begats a loss over there, and one worry here begats a concern over there, and next thing you know, you're not really focused to enjoy the life that God gave us to enjoy and live and be.
And so that I can be productive.
Oh,
instead of just being a bump on a log.
Absolutely.
I don't have to worry about these major things. We're going to get, well, you've covered two of them so far.
Two of them, and we'll cover that third one here.
Now this one, we've got a number of slides, so I'm moving this right along. This is a book by Steven Pinker, who is a Harvard psychologist, PhD, and Dr. Pinker was rated by Time years ago as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And he did this study, summarized in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, a recent book, that shows that, guess what, despite whatever distressing daily news we might be facing, life is a lot better today than it was long ago. And he shows all kinds of charts and graphs and evidence in this thing. This is one of them. And this one shows battle-related deaths per 100,000 people. Okay, now here's, 1950, you had Korea and all that. Here's Vietnam in here. You've got more skirmishes going on here. But look at this curve. I mean, down to 2010, 0.3.
If we were to look at this, Zane, like a stock market chart, you're absolutely right. I think you're saying that the better we get, the lower we have in terms of losses, fatalities, serious disabling injuries. So we see that as we reduce conflict on a global scale.
Okay, let's move on to the next display here. Oh, this is an interesting one. This is a chart of Americans at work and out of work from 2008, when the big crash happened that caused the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, down to now, to 2018. And so Don, you might want to comment on the employed curve and the unemployed curve and how they're diverging.
Well, it is an interesting fact that employment is increasing since the financial crisis of 2008, and I'll add 2009. Interesting too, it is a lagging indicator in one sense that we had the crisis at its peak in 2008. The stock market started to recover around March of 2009, which was the point where the unemployment or the employment was at its lowest. And as we put the two together, you'll see that as employment increased to the present time today, the unemployed or unemployment also decreased as well. So this gap, as we see it, is actually pretty good, but we still have a fair amount of unemployment, and that's because a lot of folks in here in the post-recession years of 2011, well, almost 2010, 2011, 2012, frankly just dropped off the radar. They did not have, their unemployment insurance benefits ran out, so they were not statistically counted, and they also got older, so it's harder to find a job after getting older, and of course...
And a lot of them are self-employed.
Self-employed, yes, exactly.
But in my lifetime here, Don, we're now at the last figure I saw was our unemployment is 3.8%. That's the lowest in my lifetime. So that should be very good news, except for what's not on the radar. It sounds like good news. Hey, everybody's got a job. But the problem is everybody may have 2 or 3 jobs just to make it work. And that's where we look at the next one. Well, here's the chart actually that showed when the crash happened in 2008. Then Barack Obama became president, and you could see what he inherited. Ever since that time, even up to now, this chart stops at 2016, it's been on the upswing with regard to jobs and even GDP growth ever since the Economic Recovery Act of 2009 that President Obama instituted. It did rescue the economy. It kept the economic situation a great recession, but not a depression. It prevented a depression. The problem is he only got about a third of the stimulus that he really wanted. He wanted about $2.5 trillion of investment in infrastructure, economic recovery of various types, aid to the states. He got $787 billion. It stopped the depression, but it didn't give us a robust recovery. It was still better than what Europe did, where Europe went into austerity. They actually contracted, and they went down while we were going up. And then following that came the crisis in Greece, one in Spain and one in Italy. So at least the Obama administration was able to turn that around.
Yeah.
Now, here's another one. We're moving right along here. We have another thing that's going on. We saw that unemployment's been going down, employment's been going up, but we have this huge disparity in the top 1% in terms of wealth of Americans. The top 1% of the curve is going way up like this, and the rest of us, the bottom 90%,
Okay.
it looks pretty close. And from 1987 on, it's shooting off differently. What's going on there? We want to find out. Well,
You're absolutely right. There is a wage disparity between, what's the phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This is an incredible spread, Zane, because we know that, and we hear this frequently in the news and just the discussion on the channels talking about the economy and such, that there is this top 1%, and then there's this great big...
The rest of us, yeah.
Yeah, the rest of us. And I think what comes to mind also is the erosion of the middle class. In other words, there's only 2 classes. The very wealthy, which you would say is the 1%, and then the rest of us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at what's going on.
Let's see
Here's
that,
a recent study by a couple of economists from a paper done by Kinderman and Kruger, and they're showing marginal tax rates. This is the tax rate that's charged once you make more than a certain amount of money. And as I recall, that certain amount of money is in the hundreds of thousands. But once you get over that amount of money, subject to income tax, rates used to be really high. I mean, okay, here's, all right, let's say 1953, Truman, here's during Kennedy, the 60s, 73, Carter, even under Reagan in 1983, well, the marginal tax rate was still, let's see, that's about 30, little less than 30%.
28%.
It went back up here to about 40. And they're saying, well, we're here at this point in time, and they claim we should be up here and taxing the rich a lot more. I don't know if we need to be that high, but that disparity that we can see of the very wealthy 1% versus the rest of us, that hypothetically should be creating more jobs with these rich people investing more. That's one thought. But it turns out it doesn't work that way. What happens is these rich people are actually hoarding what they have. And so they're not really, the last thing you want to do in a business is hire people. You want to make it work very well with the resources you have, equipment and people. And you hold out as long as you can to maximize your profit, take care of your stockholders. And so here's a chart with profits, which are here in, this is gross profits to GDP, the red curve, and over here in blue is wages to GDP. So here go these profits. They're way up there for companies, corporations, and yet wages and salaries are going way down. Here they are going down this way. Well, this indicates that labor has a lot less influence than they used to have. I mean, labor unions today are crushed. I mean, they were pretty well crushed from the times of the 60s and when they were quite strong. Right now, labor unions are very, very weak. And so you have economic growth, and here's America, for example, economic growth, low income rate, the share of households earning less than the median as of 2016. The United States is one of the lowest. I mean, Greece, which went bankrupt, is at the top. Then comes Spain, which also practically went bankrupt. And we're really the third worst in terms of that, because we're not, this money, the profits are there, but it's not going to working people. And so here's Nick Hanauer. He's a multi-billionaire who did a chart on all this. Nick Hanauer actually was responsible for co-capitalizing Amazon.com. And he put out a chart, which is on TED, that says, well, if we had kept the same ratio of growth to the pace of the GDP growth, that today the average salary of a person would be $92,000. Well, in Pasadena, if I had $92,000 today, I could afford about a $450,000 home. But this would be the average today, which didn't happen. We're down around $50,000 today. Well, you might want to comment on this.
Since you mentioned housing, affordable homes. Funding for affordable homes. The yearly totals show a decline in since the bottom of the housing market. I think it was around 2008 when prices peaked, and then they actually peaked, I think, a couple years earlier, and then they started to come down. But as you see here, the affordable home funding is way down from its peak around 2008 to from 100 million down to about a fourth of that, to 26 million just in recent time. Now, the other thing too, the rental vacancy rates in California are at a 30-year low. In California, only 4% of the available housing is available for rent, vacant.
Well, now that shows if you've only got 4%, that means nothing, because that's a frictional number there that you really don't go below. So if you're down to 4% available housing, there's not enough housing.
There's nothing. Yeah, because you've got to account for the people that move, retire, or move out of state, and just the natural flow. But if you're talking about people that need a place to live,
we're hurting in California.
We're very much hurting, and we've heard about the lack of new housing starts in the LA area and in recent months. And yeah, we're very
we're down. So we got to do something about that.
Sure.
Now here's something that also recalls another program we had on economic solutions. If you take three key things, some of them connected with national happiness. For example, universal access to higher education is one of the three highest things in the University of Leicester study for national happiness. Well, look at this curve. This is college tuition, 1978 to 2010. And here's the consumer price index in red down here, which is staying almost flat compared to this huge inflation in college costs. I mentioned another program. I went to USC, private school. My tuition was $970 a year. UCLA was about $300. Anybody could afford to go to college. It would be the cost of a summer vacation for a year's term as far as tuition goes. That's not happening now. And one of the reasons that's not happening is because we are crimping government. We're not funding government. Government can't support this kind of education anymore. So up goes college tuition for state schools, and private goes up as well. USC is now a research institution where the tuition is about $60,000 per year. There's no way I could have gone there now. Healthcare, here's the other one. See, look at healthcare spending here compared to other countries.
Exactly so. And there's so much waste in healthcare because premiums that are collected don't necessarily go to those that need the medical care. They're just collected premiums.
And if I'm an insurance company and you are a patient who needs care, it's in my self-interest as a company to give you as little as I can. You know, I'm not interested in your health as much as I'm interested in cutting back my outlays in order to support whatever condition you have. Therefore, if you've got a pre-existing condition, I want to close you out, you know.
Well, an interesting observation I made during my years in business was that a healthy population, let's say, and a healthy working population is between early 20s to maybe mid to late 40s. Okay, but during that time, you could have a different insurance carrier or an HMO every one of those 25, 30 years, we'll say. But the problem with that is that the money that you've paid into that system may not be the luck of the draw when you do get that catastrophic injury or illness. It goes to whatever insurance company you have at age, let's say 50. They have not collected any of those premium dollars for 25, 30 years. So their incentive, as you indicate, is not to necessarily treat you well, but they don't have the financial underwriting, for better words,
Yeah.
to have said, well, he's already or she has paid into the system, and maybe by that virtue, economically speaking, they've already paid for their medical care for 25, 30 years.
To other people.
Well, yeah, it's gone to other people who may have benefited, but who never paid in.
So you're pointing out a systemic flaw. Don.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
true. Now, the other one is, housing. This, we all need shelter, health care, and higher education, hopefully, if we want to get smarter and more informed. And here's the curve on sales prices of homes. We have a shortage of homes, and yet the curve's doing that. So this is causing economic pressures on the United States. With regard to basic services, first of all, roads, Social Security, wars in our case, bank bailouts also in our case, corporate subsidies, yes, we do those. These other items in red, college, daycare, nursing home, healthcare, these are private things. These are not provided through government. And these silver dollars or chips or whatever they may be, they cover all of these items, but it costs a whole lot more than France over here, which, remember, they have universal health care. They live longer than we do. And their cost is often governmentally administered, but it's a lot less than ours, and it becomes more dramatic with this next slide that you might comment on, Don.
Well, the basic services, as you indicate, that we all enjoy, with some exceptions to the roads, because now we have to pay for HOV lanes in some parts of LA and Orange County. Really what it is that we're paying a lot of money through the private sector for benefits that are already at substantially lower cost in the country of France. But when we look at not only just the benefits that we may be paying in the private sector for, there are extensive benefits upon the benefits, such as longer paid vacation in France, not just your 2 weeks during the first 5 years of employment. You've got definitely more of a paid medical leave for even family care, which could extend all the way to a year for the mothers of the children in these countries. Great schools, obviously. Transportation. I've never personally been to France, but they do have an infrastructure that is far superior to our system here in the United States on a country comparison.
Well, they have bullet trains, for
and
one
they
thing.
have the bullet train. Which,
They also have, medically, their doctors make house calls.
yeah.
Which, now they do pay higher taxes than we do. You can see their chips are a little higher, but all this stuff we do privately, they've already got covered publicly.
Right.
Which again is an embarrassment.
But it's only for the benefit in the red here in the United States for those that can afford the private cost of these benefits. For example, we talked about universal health care. Before Obamacare came along, or the Affordable Care Act, the pricing for this was based on age bands of 5 years. So you could see a chart that shows if you're 20 to 25, brand new, let's say out of college, you're paying almost 1/5 the amount of money that a person just prior to Medicare, that is the age from 60 to 65, would pay for the same coverage.
Sure,
So-
older, therefore more care.
More care. Well, there might be more issues with illness at that age and disease that comes degeneratively speaking. But by the same token, again, if that person is not making a living wage or works for a company that has the medical benefit available to him or her, they don't get it. So then we have a medically deprived citizen who can't access the private sector. That's the other important thing. It's not only the affordability of it, poverty, it's access to it by a number of other factors, including pre-existing conditions that were once the mainstay of denied coverage in healthcare policies.
Now, I want to comment on another thing. And thank you, Don, for explaining that. Another thing I know, I've been to Belgium. I've seen what they do. It's somewhat similar to France. What happens in France, it's not just a government-administered healthcare system. If I'm a very wealthy person in France, I can access their private sector separate from any governmental universal healthcare. I have that option in France. I guess it would be called the private option. I don't know. But anyway, I can go there in France, and let's say I want to have a cloned organ. I want a cloned liver. This might cost an astronomical amount of money, but if I'm very wealthy, I can afford that. And in France, that's available if I do that. We have a previous vice president, Dick Cheney, who has a new heart. He has a heart transplant. He's healthy as can be now. Well, in the future, somebody like him could have a cloned heart. It would even be perfectly compatible with his. So France has this kind of availability privately to get up here if they needed to for some exotic stem cell treatment or who knows what, cloning that will come in the future, and they can get that in France. So, but remember, they get it for half our cost, basically, and they live longer than we do. So their system, it's just
working.
What the evidence, something is
working.
Something's working.
Yeah.
Lesser social issues. This is a good one.
Yeah, I think you talked about that earlier, that when we look at the three important things that keep people, a society happy in a given country, being low poverty, universal health care, and access to paid higher education, college. Frequently, we see in the discussion of other things in the news, particularly other issues that may be considered, as you describe here, of a lesser social significance than the three that actually factor into that study from the University of Leicester that showed what actually causes societal happiness. So occasionally we get our attention to those things you've listed here, Zane, on the screen. The abortion issue, certainly, illegal immigration, the national debt, we touched on that a little bit, and this could be, depending upon what channel you watch on your television, liberal economics versus conservative, and is the market going up or down, the crash, the this or that. So, but you're right, these are frequently in the news and tend to deter or distract from the core issues that the university study showed are principally in the context of how can we improve our society? How can we make things better? So I don't have to worry while I'm not driving my car, somebody won't start clogging up the freeway with a shooting or a school shooting or some social thing that is a significant indication that somebody's very unhappy or mentally ill or just got prone to settle their argument with violence.
That's right, Don. What I'm seeing here, and I picked these things, and you have some. These are prominent media presented issues right now. Abortion, it's a big issue. Illegal immigration, big issue. In fact, there was a poll recently, I think it was Gallup, that found that this is the number one issue on people's minds at the moment is illegal immigration. So a lot, media coverage and dissemination has a lot to do with what do we really think is important. In this show, we're actually trying to look at fundamentals to find out, hey, happiest countries, here's what they're doing. We're not talking about abortion. As a matter of fact, abortion is legal in the Muslim nation of Tunisia on demand, any way you want it. So here's abortion. It's unlimited in 63 countries. It's available to varying degrees in 173 countries. My point here is that this is what I would call a siphoning issue that siphons our attention away from those three fundamentals, universal health care, low poverty, universal access to higher education. We should be focused on those. but we can get a lot of media sensation by covering these sensational subjects. And by the way, when you talk about embryo development, it starts with a gastrula, which is a multicellular organism after fertilization of the egg. That's up to 3 weeks. Fetus begins at the end of 8 weeks. You don't even have a fetus in a human female until 8 weeks. You have a viable fetus outside of the body in 21 weeks. So science will say, well, you have faith-based, and if we're faith-based, we'll say, look, it's immoral to end the life as soon as an egg is fertilized. That's one view. Science says, well, we have to define what a human being is to begin with. And science has found, well, you don't even have a fetus until 8 weeks. So I'm just saying, people can argue this, but it's not universal health care, it's not low poverty, it's not universal access to higher education, which are the three main components of national happiness. Personally, yeah, this, and nobody wants to kill an organism, but it's a siphoning issue, in my opinion. Illegal immigration, guess what? Illegals, and this is according to Pew Research, a very prestigious institutional organization that just completed a study recently. Well, only 3.4% of the United States population consists of illegal immigrants. 3.4%.
So that would be about 10 million.
About 10 million,
Yeah.
yeah. Now, in California, we have about double that percentage. However, does this issue merit the stature compared to universal health care, low poverty, universal access to higher education? I would argue it's a minor issue, but it is one that has been made sensational and can capture our attention and divert us from really focusing and working together toward those three big ones. Liberal economics, well, yeah, my background is economics, and I had the privilege of studying under Mr. Greenspan before he was Fed chairman. I came from a very different political persuasion at that time. But when you look at the actual facts, the most severe economic crashes in the United States were in 1893, 1929, and 2008. And all of them were under the political party I was registered in, the Republican Party. And they were all remedied by Democratic Party, which is, it's counterintuitive. Because here are these liberals that are considered spendthrifts, irresponsible, they're going to raise the national debt. Well, as it turned out, actually, Ronald Reagan and W. Bush hold the record in those categories. You had Barack Obama temporarily using a huge deficit to get the economy rolling again, and even then he only did a third of what he wanted to do. So when you look at the policies, and why is it that a more, quote, conservative, what does a conservative administration do that led to these crashes? Well, by historical study, and Ben Bernanke was a previous head of the Federal Reserve who had researched this extensively, he have found that, well, basically what those three administrations had done in those years, up to those years where those crashes occurred, they had fewer regulations of the economy. They had much higher speculations that just went out of control. And therefore, the so-called conservative administrations that you would think would want to keep things more stable, more controlled, more safer, they turned out to be the least responsible. And so we had these crashes. And then you had these liberal administrations that you think these guys are spendthrifts, they're going to be socialists. And by the way, socialism is government ownership of all means of production and property. It is not just redistributing from rich to poor. It's when the government owns. So when when General Motors failed, the government bought like 60% of its stock and owned General Motors for a while. That was socialism. And the government divested itself in the marketplace over about a year and a half's time to where GM became privately owned again at the cost of $11 billion of taxpayer money that was lost in that. But that was socialism. When the government buys it and owns it and runs it, that's socialism. But the other thing, when the government simply finances it or administers the financing of it to the private sector. That's something called civic capitalism, and our show number 3 of Economic Solutions covers that. So anyway, this is paradoxical. You would think that the first guys were more responsible, they were more cautious, more careful. No, actually it went the other way.
Yeah.
And then these guys that are supposed to be irresponsible, spendthrifts, so-called socialists, or loose with the way they expend resources. Well, what do you know? They actually have a better record than my old guys. Okay, constitutional amendments. You want to discuss some of these things we might do to try to enhance our happiness as a nation?
Well, I think the first item there was that consideration that every vote counts. We have in that argument the Electoral College, which is really a representation of votes. Basically the theory there to equalize the vote in some way so that one or two states don't dictate the outcome of an election. Certainly California is the largest state by population, but we are in a situation where we could be determining the next president based on the popularity vote, which would be the constitutional consideration that we should abolish the electoral college entirely and do a direct popular vote of the and that would have changed from what I recall in terms of the recent election with Trump and Clinton. To speak of, the popular vote went to Mrs. Clinton, but the electoral college vote went to President Trump.
Which it also had done with G.W. Bush. The electoral college
Yes.
went one way.
You're
Now,
right.
to give a moment here, the founders had good
Intentions.
intentions and a good. Their instincts seem to be correct from the standpoint of, well, we don't know if the general population is going to go crazy and vote for some irresponsible leadership, And so what we want to do is we want to have elites who are going to be the electors.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the electors have constituents in their districts, in their state districts, who might vote for a given candidate, it's the electors who are going to decide. So they may get most votes in certain districts, but the electors, being elite patricians, not plebeians, not the hoi polloi, they're going to make rational decisions, and it's going to keep the country afloat. This is what the founding fathers had in mind with the Electoral College. It should work very well if we have an irrational, irresponsible electorate in terms of the general public. Well, it turned out in 2016 it was a tremendous laboratory experiment in that way, in that the winner of the election actually got 4.6% less votes from the votes that were cast for him, 4.6% less than the loser in the election did. And only 7 electors turned out to be what's called faithless. They vote against how their electorate had voted. And 7 out of 538 electors. So you had practically no deviation. And out of the 7, 5 of the 7 had voted for the president who was elected. And only 2 had voted for the one who lost. But even then, it was only 7 out of 538. And with a 4.6% disparity on this, showing that here was the person who won the election was a real estate developer who had no background in public service and who had little knowledge of the Constitution, even advocated publicly torture of prisoners, which is against the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution and 3 treaties that the United States ratified that prohibit torture. But here was a president coming in and saying, "Oh no, we're not torturing them enough," our enemies. Quite illiterate on that score, and a background in real estate development rather than public service at all. How about this one, equal rights?
Well, I think if I'm reading this correctly, it would be equal rights guaranteed regardless of sex, particularly in the area of wage differences. Mm-hmm. I'm not, again, an expert in this. I've only been one to sort of observe things based on payroll data and other comparatives, but the argument has been made with some proof, those making the argument, that women have been paid less in jobs that their counterparts, male counterparts, have been doing, and side by side, the net result is the same product. So why should women end up being paid less for doing the same job the man is doing?
So that's called the ERA amendment proposed.
Yeah,
And then
that would be included in equal rights.
okay.
Right.
Then we have the so-called "we the people." They always use euphemisms for the names of these amendments.
Exactly.
But anyway, the "we the people" is basically that we want to not have corporations be treated as persons with regard to elections anymore, to where they can muster huge amounts of contributions
Campaign
for
funding.
campaign funding.
Yeah.
So this is, no, don't let corporations be considered persons from that standpoint. And then there was one more that was kind of interesting down here, this one.
Well, let me read it here. It says, the equal opportunity to govern allow naturalized citizens with at least 20 years citizenship to become president. Okay, that might involve someone like, shall we say, Arnold Schwarzenegger, our past governor here in California, who, by virtue of this amendment, could then run for president of the United States.
I wonder if he sponsored it.
Darn if I know.
But yeah,
Let's put your research team back to find that out.
it draws upon a bigger pool.
Well-
I mean, you might have some real talent who just weren't lucky enough to be born here, but they've been here a long time and shown themselves to be very capable. So it gives you a bigger pool to draw upon. Okay, well, we're getting to the end of our program at this point. And you want to read that one?
Sure. We live in a very divided world, in a very divided nation, and only by stepping into other people's cultures can we break out of the molds we have set for ourselves. Quoted from Andrew Chater.
And Andrew Chater is a film producer, film and TV producer. He's done over 50 awards. He's won British Academy of Film and Television Arts Awards, and he lectures in history at the University of Southern California right now. And I thought this would be a very appropriate thing. He's British and gives us a perspective that, what do you know, we really need to expose ourselves to many cultures and not be too provincial if we're going to learn and continue to grow the way America has traditionally. We draw on many cultures and we use those cultures. As soon as we retreat into a shell, we're insulating ourselves, our intelligence goes down, our wisdom goes down. And he says, no, we already live in a very divided world. Get out there and expose to other cultures, you'll be surprised at what you might learn. And we showed that, for example, with France, or we showed it with the University of Leicester in England, comparative happiness study. So this is what has been found as of this point in time to really get a happy country, a happier nation among other happy nations. Look at what they're doing. Drop our vanity and say, hey, we can learn something. We don't have to claim we're the best at everything. America has grown by increasing our information and learning about our ignorance and doing something about it. So with that, Don, I just want to end the program with a thought I have, a brief thought I have, that the more we help each other, the more we trust each other. Thanks very much. I'm Leonard Zane. See you next time.